So every organization, every church has a life cycle. And so, and I'm sure you've seen, we've all seen a bell curve, correct? Yes, seen a bell curve before. It's used in anything that's research. There's always a bell curve. There's always, the high end, low end, and, the tails and the each of the other ends. An organization always goes through life cycle, and you've seen this. Like, you've seen this in churches. I'm sure you've visited churches where you've seen them at various stages. And so what I want to do is I want to kind of walk through this and just kind of process through not only a church itself, but each of our own ministries and each of our own positions. And so you start here on one end. You start with infancy, and then you move on to childhood. You have adolescence. Prime. Maturity. Aristocracy. And then you have death. And if you ever look at a life cycle, at an organizational life cycle, there's going to be different variations, different words, whatever. This one actually comes from Hans Finzel, his book, Top 10 Mistakes Leaders Make. He uses this particularly for churches. And what we see here is we see this life cycle, but there's also 4 elements. So we call it SMORE. S is spiritual. M is missional. O is organizational. And then R is relational. Okay. At different stages throughout the life cycle, each one of these runs different intensities. And so let's imagine church plant. All right. Have you guys actually been a part of a church plant, a launch? Okay. So in a church plant, usually what you find in a church plant is you find high spiritual, right? And then everything else is small. High spiritual. We're God's called us. We're excited about this. We're in this. We're all coming together. Some of us might know each other, but we really don't know each other. Part of a launch team, we've been pulled from all over the country or whatever the case is. High spiritual, high belief in what God's going to do, high belief in what God's going to accomplish in this community, how He's going to move, all those things. High spiritual. And then we move to childhood. We've moved to a point where we still have high spiritual. Now we have high relational. Because we've been in this, we've launched, we've kind of come on the other side of launch. We're starting to see people, our core congregation is starting to take shape. We're starting to know each other and feel each other out and develop relationships. And so we have high spiritual because we're still on that, God is moving and we're seeing that. Part of it's because at this stage, a lot of times you don't have all the bells and whistles. You don't have not everything's ironed out, but you have this intense mentality. We're going to chase after God. We're going to really go after Him. We're going to tarry. We're going to pray, like all those things. And then we move from childhood into adolescence. Still high spiritual. Now we have high missional. And we still have high relational. We've kind of come out of we're launching the church and trying to keep our feet under us. Now our feet are under us. We know who we are. We have an identity. The community kind of knows who we are. They understand what we're about, but we don't really have like a long-term strategy. We don't really know long-term what we want to do. And so in adolescence, that's what we have. We have high mission. We have our strategy. We know like in 10 years, this is what we want. This is what our impact is going to be in this community. We want this reality for our community. We want to reach these people. We want to fix these problems, address them, whatever. High mission. When we get to our prime, everything is running. we've gotten our missional down in our adolescence. And so the next question is, okay, we know where we're going, but we don't have the systems to get there.
Yeah.
So then we get high organization. We start building better systems, better processes. We get our feet, not only under us, but we get our feet concreted in so that we're stable. We have a strong foundation. We know kind of what's happening, and everything seems to be working. Everything's running on all cylinders. This stage right here, all of them have various time frames, but this stage can last anywhere from 5 years to 25 years. It just depends on how well all this is maintained. So after prime, the ironic part about how the organization or how the church life cycle works is when you move from prime into maturity, the first thing to go, spiritual. The first thing to go is your spiritual. And the reason is, this is my own theory, the reason is because now that you have strong organizational, you believe you can keep doing it. And we neglect. This comes from neglect more than anything else. So spiritual drops, we still high missional, high organizational, high relational. From maturity to aristocracy, the things that we lose is missional and relational. We're still riding that same wave of organizational. We've created great systems, great processes, and that's what stabilizes us. And so what happens is you start to get factions in your church. You start getting even a church split or two along the way. Relational goes, your missional goes, because remember, your relational, spiritual, and missional, those are kind of what anchored you on the front end.
Yeah.
Once you get that organizational piece, it becomes what anchors you, and all the other three start to go by the wayside. This is where we have churches with no mission. No mission. People come in, visitors come in. Maybe you have a great experience, but there's just no real reason for people to stick around. And then, obviously, after that, you just end up with nothing left. Everything goes. So, unfortunately for us, we have a first-hand experience of that. This is Open Door. This is where they are.
Yeah.
And they've probably been here for a good 10, maybe 15 years. Yeah. So, the question always becomes, how do we avoid this? Like, how do we enjoy this without falling into this?
Yeah.
What I said last week, leaders are change agents. Change is the key. But God gravitates towards motion. We always want God to move, but then we are standing still waiting for God to move. When you look at Scripture, most of the time, people are in motion, and God just comes alongside and blesses that. Well, I think in the same way here, when you get to maturity, and then obviously when you get over into aristocracy, you're not in motion anymore. You're standing, you're entrenched in, you're relying on your organizational skills, your organizational policies, all those things. The key is how do we create change? Now, one of the places that you can create change, and usually the most obvious place, is right here. Create change. And the reason this is the most obvious place is because you've gone through your prime, you've hit maturity, but even when you hit maturity, there's a spiritual element that's missing. And if you as a leader, as the pastor, your board, maybe some of your more in tune leaders in the congregation, if they are paying attention, they will sense that something is wrong. Something is off. They may not be able to put their finger on it, but they know that they've moved from here to here, and they can't figure out why. They can't figure out what the problem is. And like I've said, it's the spiritual element is missing. And so then what happens is then the question is, okay, well, what do we need to do? Like, how do we need to fix this, whatever? And so they start looking at this point of change. This is a critical point because if they pass this, if this gets passed, The only thing next is this. So this is a critical point in every church life cycle of, okay, we need to reinvent who we are in some way or another so that we don't fall here. When we do that, when this is changed, we come back over here and create a new point. And then what that does is it creates a whole new life cycle. Because when you go through a major change, you're not in prime anymore. Because now you've reinvented. You have to refigure it all out. And so you create the change. Now this could be something as far as like, maybe you launch a new campus, maybe you do campuses for the first time, maybe you change worship style, maybe you do away with the choir for the first time, maybe you launch an entire new ministry, outreach ministry, whatever. Something that's going to shake up. It has to be significant enough to shake up the entire congregation. You can't launch something on the side that impacts like 30% of the church and everybody else just keeps going on their merry way. It has to be something that's significant enough that a majority of your church pays attention and is somehow impacted by it. Now, so Pastor Scott, my pastor in Dallas, what he taught us was that you can make change here. That's your one option. The other option, though, is to go ahead and just make change here before you reach prime. And his reasoning was, if you make change here, the downside is you're going to have people saying, why would we change that? Why do it? Because they haven't felt any need to change. Why would we change that? But the downside of changing here is that you've already gone through this phase.
Yep.
This phase right here. That phase right there is where you start to lose people. And not lose people in attendance, but lose people in followership. This is in this phase right here, this is where board members become comfortable. It's where they're like, why would I think we're good. Everything's running smoothly, everything is going well. Why? Even staff members. Why? Why would we change? Here, the question why is, why would we change? Because everything's working really well. Here, why would we change? Everything is comfortable. But what Scott said, his mentality, his perspective was, there are less questions here at this one than there are at this one. People haven't had a chance to become comfortable on the first one, and they're pretty used to change and shifting, and so you just keep doing it. You may never reach prime, obviously, but you never run the risk of slipping into maturity. Yeah, and we have to differentiate between spiritual maturity within the congregation and the life cycle of the church itself. Because you can have, and quite honestly, I would argue that when you're in this phase, like adolescence to prime into maturity, in that window, you have some pretty spiritually mature individuals.
Yeah.
I think the risk is when you get on the other side of maturity, some of those spiritually mature individuals become too comfortable and they lose that spiritual edge.
Yeah.
We want to come to a place as a church where we have strong spiritual maturity within the church. And I would agree. I think we can't really move forward until we have that, continue to build that strong foundation. But that would be different than the life cycle that we are in as a church, as an organization. And I would say honestly, it's pretty hard to reach an adolescent stage without a core group of spiritually mature people. I think that would be pretty difficult to do. And so the thing, even for like, I would look at us. Like I would say we have a pretty strong core of spiritually mature people. And I would put us somewhere in this area right here, like in that adolescent stage. I mean, would you guys say we're at the prime stage yet? No. But I would say and probably in my own experience, I would say we have a higher percentage of spiritually mature people within our congregation than other churches of the same size that I've been around. So yeah, so those would be two separate things.
I guess my next question would be, so if you're making change kind of in that window before, kind of, I mean, I guess we kind of experience it a little bit, but yeah, like I guess, what more does that look like, you know? Because obviously over there it has to be significant change. What is this smaller change, or is this also significant change?
No, it doesn't have to be as simple.
Okay, gotcha.
It doesn't. Simply because when you reach this point, I wouldn't say majority, but a good percentage is comfortable. They like how things work. They like what's going on. They like the programs. They don't want to change youth ministry. They don't want to change kids ministry. Like, they don't want those things to change. And so, yeah, so it's a smaller change here because people are already in motion. Because again, like, most people aren't very comfortable at this stage. So again, don't just think of this at the church level, though. Think of it at your own level, your departments, your ministries. Because you can have a church. So you see it mostly in youth ministry. You can have a church that's constantly changing and moving and whatever, and you have this youth ministry that kind of is its own thing. It's successful, it's large, and they kind of create their own culture and own life cycle. And there can come a point where that ministry now becomes detached from the rest of the church, because the church is moving, but hey, the successful youth ministry, we don't want to mess with that. We don't want to change it. And it can get to a point where it's in this stage where they go from 500 kids to 150 kids. They're like, what's going on? What's happening? Well, you're running the same program, it looks the same, it's not really changed. Mm-hmm. Everything is the same it was 5 years ago. And unfortunately, with youth ministry, everything changes so much faster.
Yeah.
And so, every department can run its own life cycle and at some point become detached. And you've seen it the other side too. A church could be clear over here, and you can have a youth, young adult, kids ministry that's way over here. Mm-hmm. So some of it, as leaders, we have to manage not only the organization as a whole, we have to manage every program and every ministry's life cycle where it is in light of us as a church, as a whole church. Especially when you think about your teams. Think about, okay, who needs to shift, who needs to learn something new, who needs to develop something, who needs to be off, who needs to get on, those types of questions. Well, and the thing is what the allure of maturity is the machine is running. We've created a machine that runs. It doesn't take a lot of effort. It doesn't take a lot of, oversight. It just runs. And that's great. Like, especially when you've gone through the exhaustion of all the other phases and you get to that, you're like, whew, we can breathe. But the reality of every system is working to become disorganized. It's a law of systems. Every system works to become disorganized. There's something innate within a system that becomes disorganized over time. And so you can never just let a system run, because over time it will become disorganized. One of the things that we have to be careful of is that when we are delegating to other leaders, especially our coaches and our captains, when we're giving them things to do, we have to make sure that we're not just giving them things to do. We are empowering them to lead, to make changes, to make decisions, because we at this level don't have time to make sure that every ministry that's under us is having that same spiritual connection and motion and forward mentality. When we put people in place, we either have to develop them to have that, or we need to get somebody else who does. Because if we're putting people in just to run the machine, it will get disorganized over time, because they're just doing what we told them. We need leaders who will make decisions and go to God and seek His face for the future of that ministry in that area. Obviously we keep a hand on it and we, stay in touch, but I think that we don't have even the spiritual capacity all the time to do that for every single ministry under us. And maybe right now we do, because we don't have that many ministries running. But again, in 5 years, there's going to be a lot of things going on that we just don't have the time to put our eyes and our spiritual sense on. So we have to develop better leaders to take those areas. Well, and something we have to also be mindful of is that even within our core group of people, even within our coaches and our leaders, even on staff, for the most part, we're okay with the chaos that they can sometimes create. But we also have to be mindful, like, we have to sense when our leaders are running on empty.
Yeah.
We have to sense that. We have to know when to tell them, take a break. Even within our leadership structure, we need to have built-in breaks. Whether it's like, hey, I just need you to take a couple months off. Not because you do anything wrong, but because you just need a break. Because I'm trying to, this can feel like we're constantly sprinting. And we have to mentally remember ministry is a marathon. And so even though we feel like we're constantly sprinting, we have to create space for ourselves as well as for our leaders to make sure that they make the long journey, not just the sprint. Because the other side of that is we can burn people out and we cycle through people too quickly. And one of the things that will cause us to get into maturity is we've just run out of people. Not that that's really possible, but there's a point, even I think for me, there's a spiritual responsibility that I think there's a point where God says, man, you're just burning everybody out. Like, I'm not sending anybody else to you because you're just burning them. And so I think that we have to be careful with our leaders, make sure we're taking care of them in the process, making sure we're keeping mindful of where they are, what their needs are, and just helping them along the way. Because it can feel, I mean, you guys know, like it can feel like a lot all the time. And we just have to be mindful of, okay, when do we have the space for family, for breaks, for mental, like our mental and emotional state? Like, where are those breaks? How do we build those in? And how do we really take advantage of them